The idea that brothels may have existed in National Socialist concentration camps for the use of prisoners may at first seem quite absurd. However, they did exist, and in this presentation I shall talk about how they came about and what purpose they served. In the summer of 1941, the chief of the SS, Reichsführer-SS Heinrich Himmler, and Oswald Pohl, the chief of the Economic and Administrative Main Office, visited the Mauthausen concentration camp near Linz in Austria. They went to both have a look at the base camp and the sub-camp of Gusen. Anyone who has read Albert Speer's book Inside the Third Reich will know of Hitler's architectural fantasies and his desire for mega projects, including the complete rebuilding of Berlin. In the opinion of the Nazi dictator, other cities were also in need of a complete makeover, such as Hamburg, Munich, Weimar and Linz, the latter being his obsession at the very end of the war, with the Red Army only a few hundred meters from where he was enjoying his architectural models. All of this, of course, required a great deal of building materials, and the quarries at places such as Mauthausen and Gusen provided some of it. Prisoner productivity was a major problem. Obviously, it was beyond the comprehension of the National Socialist that a person given proper tools, who is properly fed and can go home at night, is much likely to do a better job than one who is not. Nonetheless, means of increasing productivity were discussed as early as 1942 with Hans Kammler, who was head of the construction branch of the WVHA. Himmler, wanting to know why productivity per person was double in private industry to what it was in the concentration camps. One idea he came up with was setting up of brothels for prisoners, and the first was established in Mauthausen in June 1942. The service provider in this case was to come from women who were in the inmate category asocial. Asocials were identified by a reverse black triangle on their uniform, and in total there were between 60 and 80,000 of them locked up in the concentration camp system of both sexes. The definition of an asocial was much more difficult. Like much within the Nazi system, it was extremely vague. According to the Basic Decree on Preventative Crime Fighting of the 14th of December 1937, anyone who endangers the general public through their asocial behaviour without being a professional or habitual criminal could be sent to a concentration camp as part of preventative detention by the criminal police. The decision as to whether conduct contrary to the community existed lay solely with the regulatory and police authorities. In the spring and summer of 1938, as part of the Work-Shy Right campaign, there were waves of arrest, resulting in more than 10,000 people being deported to concentration camps. To give an approximate guide to the category, it would include those that did not accept the National Socialist system and did not want to join the Nazi youth or social groups. It would also include the homeless, people living off welfare or charity, beggars, vagrants, alcoholics, people dependent on narcotics, and the like. Indeed, there are many people within the Nazi leadership who would theoretically qualify as being asocial. However, that wasn't how the system worked. The asocials were the largest group in the concentration camps before 1939, being more numerous than even the political category. As far as the National Socialist system was concerned, prisoners were cheap labour and they were shamelessly exploited. From 1940 there was a severe shortage of skilled workers in companies important to the SS, and prisoners were expected to make up the shortfall. The elite amongst the prisoners had access to privileges which the vast majority of inmates had no access to. The National Socialist racial ideology played an important role here. No matter how skilled a Jewish prisoner could potentially be, no Jewish prisoners had access to the upper echelons of camp society. Only better off prisoners, or those with connections to them, were even included in the reward system. In May 1943, a service regulation for the granting of benefits to prisoners was introduced throughout the concentration camp system, whereby male inmates with higher work performances were allowed to have a military haircut, an official allocation of cigarettes, a higher frequency of letters, shopping in the commissary, and visits to the brothel. Sexual slavery was part of the gratuity system designed to resolve the fundamental contradiction between work and survival and to maximize the exploitation of prisoners. The bonus system, including the camp brothels, became an integral part of the concentration camp slave labor system and its machinery of exploitation and murder from 1943, and is thus an inherent part of the Nazi reign of terror. At least 180, but probably between 200 and 220 women were forced into sexual slavery in the 10 camp brothels. Most of the women were Germans, but there were also Poles, Soviet, and possibly women from other countries as well. There were never Jewish women in the camp brothels. Many of these women forced into prostitution came from Ravensbrück, a women's concentration camp. Initially, the SS in Ravensbrück tried to get the women to voluntarily report by falsely claiming they would be released from the camp after 6 months in a brothel. Of course, in the National Socialist concentration camp system, the term voluntarily does not have much meaning. It could have been seen by the victim of a choice between that and a slow death from malnutrition and abuse, or a sudden rapid death by murder. However, the SS did want the brothel goers to believe that the women were there voluntarily. 15 minutes was allotted for each visit. There were perhaps 12 visits per day. No talking was allowed, and only the missionary position was permitted. There was a peephole so that the SS could inspect what was happening whenever they wished. The women who were selected got more food and received medical attention. Only once they were fattened up, so to speak, after 10 days or so, were they transported to the various camp brothels of the men's concentration camps. No contraception was available. If women contracted a sexually transmitted disease, they were made available for medical experiments. Pregnant women were forced to have an abortion, although there were few cases of pregnancy owing to the poor health of the inmates. This is the camp at Mauthausen where the first brothel was set up. In this photograph we can see a visit from Himmler, and whereas this dates to 1941, the barrack behind is where the brothel was located. Today, very little is left of the Mauthausen subcamp of Gusen. As we walk westwards towards the monument, the location of the former brothel still stands. As it is a private house, and in a video such as this, I don't want to show it in order to respect the privacy of the people who live there. In July 1943, the third camp brothel was set up at Flossenburg. After World War II, with large amounts of refugees coming to West Germany, where a large part of the former camp once stood was allocated for housing and the barracks were removed. However, the foundations of the former brothel can be seen today. This is what is left of the Buchenwald concentration camp near Weimar. The brothel was set up here in 1943 within the protective custody camp in Buchenwald as a means of motivation for higher performance. For this purpose, 16 female prisoners from Ravensbrück were brought to Buchenwald in July 1943 and forced into sexual slavery. Here we can see the location of the brothel at the Auschwitz main camp, which was set up in June 1943 at the behest of Himmler in Block 24A, currently the location of the museum archive. It opened in October 1943 and was intended to reward privileged prisoners only. The SS guards were forbidden from visiting. They visited a brothel in the city of Auschwitz. The SS selected more than 60 German, Polish and Ukrainian women in the women's camp in the Auschwitz II-Birkenau concentration camp for the two brothel squads in Auschwitz I and Auschwitz III Monowitz, where the brothel was set up in the autumn of 1943. The camp brothels existed until a few days before the evacuation from Auschwitz in January 1945. On the 11th of May 1944, a camp brothel was put into operation at Dachau and 6 women from Ravensbrück arrived. Towards the end of the year it was dissolved. The brothels in Neuengamme, Sachsenhausen and Mittelbau-Dora were set up in the summer of 1944. None of the buildings exist today. The brothel visitors were initially only prisoner functionaries, the capos. Only from 1943, after the introduction of the bonus system, were other prisoners allowed to visit the brothel. SS men were not allowed to visit the camp brothel. The SS had to use those in the city. Exceptions were those SS guards who had been Red Army prisoners and had changed sides, usually to avoid starving to death. Jewish prisoners and Soviet prisoners of war were never allowed to visit the brothel. At first, the brothels were frequented by prisoners who could physically afford it. Later, however, the number of visitors fell rapidly. Many political prisoners refused to visit a brothel for moral reasons. For most prisoners, the camp brothel was meaningless in the daily struggle for survival and was perceived as a grotesque facility. The visitors can be roughly divided into three groups. There were regular visitors who were physically fit enough. There were the sporadic visitors who were looking for interpersonal contact with a woman. It must be remembered that prisoners who had been in a concentration camp since the beginning of the Nazi regime may not have seen a woman for up to 10 years. There were sometimes even emotional relationships that developed between the inmates and the forced prostitutes, despite the strict ban imposed by the SS. The last group of visitors are the one-time visitors, often men who knew that they would not live much longer and wanted to experience physical contact with a woman one last time. After the Second World War, the state-run camp brothels were taboo and hushed up. After the war, almost all women hid the fact that they had been forced to work in a camp brothel. Both East and West Germany refused to recognize their victim status. Forced sex workers were still stigmatized after 1945. A statement from a former forced sex worker could have sounded like an accusation against other prisoners. This shows how perfidiously the SS brothel system worked, as it forced the brothel visitors into a position of complicity. At the same time, the forced sex workers were viewed by the prisoners as accomplices because of the better accommodation and food they received. There was no victims association for them. Indeed, their existence has only been recognized since around the 1990s. However, as early as the mid-1950s, the plight of the victims was mentioned in the French production Night and Fog. Finding survivors is difficult, although there are interviews with other concentration camp inmates who used such services. The first exhibition relating to what they went through went up around 2006 as a temporary exhibit at the museums at the former camps at Neuengamme and Buchenwald. The former brothel is clearly marked at the museum as part of the 76th liberation ceremony at Ravensbrück. A memorial for the women who were forced into sex slavery in the concentration camps was inaugurated. The leading expert on this subject is the German historian Robert Sommer, and for those wanting to know more about it, his website is given below. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that interesting. I upload every Friday at 2000 hours Central European time, and sometimes at other times as well. My specialist area in history is the Second World War, and in particular the Holocaust. So if you're interested in that, then you might want to subscribe.